Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, in most years, over the past couple of years, I had the opportunity to sit with my friend, Rabbi Nico Socolovsky, on Rosh Hashanah evening and give sort of a Jewish State of the Union, asking the big questions of what Jews should be talking about in the year to come. Over the summer, Rabbi Nico moved up to Northern California to become the senior rabbi of Shir Chadash. And so now we are recording a special podcast episode of what should the Jews be thinking about in this upcoming year. Rabbi Nico, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. It's actually an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to once again discuss with you what the Jews should be thinking about in the year that is coming. And it is always a pleasure to study Torah with you.
I love it. So we're two rabbis, so we probably have about 6 different opinions about any of these issues that I'm going to bring up. I really wanted to focus on 4 major issues that I think the Jewish community has been talking about over the past year, and I think will continue to be bigger issues. I think first and foremost, we are sort of going into a post-COVID era. Obviously, COVID is still around, but as of now, the vast majority of precautions that the Jewish community's taken have sort of ceased to exist. But we're stuck in this interesting situation. I'm trying to think even how to frame this, where we've come up with all these technological initiatives over COVID, right? So we've started live streaming services outside of the Orthodox community. We've started moving a lot of things to Zoom, weekday classes, and things like that. Now that those are no longer important precautions for health, but they're more convenient, quote unquote, I'm curious what you think this year will come, what you think about the pros and cons of this, anything and everything.
That's a very interesting question. I wouldn't use the word convenience because I think that for many, the possibility of using Zoom or other streaming channels is inclusive. That's how we include certain parts of our population. I will never forget that a couple of years ago, TBT, the community in Fullerton, where we met and we worked together, pretty early started to stream before the pandemic, and we had 2 congregants, a couple that were in the hospital for Yom Kippur, and I reached out to them after Yom Kippur, and they said to me, Rabbi, we were with you, but most importantly, you were with us. So the streaming fulfills a very, very important role. But we are dealing with you use the word convenience. I don't want to use that word, but with a lack of custom in terms of showing up, of participating now in person. If I can connect or live stream the service and have dinner at the same time, so I prefer to do that from home. And I think that we need to somehow rehab the muscle of showing up. I think it's a very important thing. But nonetheless, considering that people that are showing up in Zoom, they're showing up as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. Two immediate things pop into my head. They're actually sort of opposites here, so I'll throw them both out. One, I'm worried that the proliferation of technology, while I totally agree in terms of the inclusive elements, it's great, is leading to a further centralization of shul in terms of the liberal Jewish community, which at the forefront, that seems great. Of course, the synagogue should be the center of community, but really, I would argue the home is the center of Jewish community, and Shabbat is truly felt in Shabbat dinners with guests or Shabbat lunch or sort of in the hallways before and after davening, right? And shul is just sort of, the meeting place, right? Really the Beit HaKnesset, right? The place where people go in to gather. I'm worried that by live streaming services, we're sort of making the claim implicitly that the important practice of Shabbat is those 1, 2, 3 hours from 9 to 11 a.m., whatever time davening is, and that is your Shabbat observance. And then afterwards, if it's the case that then everyone goes and meets up for Shabbat lunch at different houses, I think that would be great. But I'm worried that the effect isn't just, oh, the seats in the shul are empty because everybody's at Zoom. I'm worried that this actually ends up affecting wider communal cohesion, because all of a sudden now, instead of shul being a place where people gather, it's becoming more and more a place where people come and they watch somebody lead services.
You could argue exactly the opposite. You could say that because we have now services that are being streamed or shared, I want to make the distinction between participation in Zoom or in a media channel that allows you to see and to be seen, as opposed to streaming a service, which is like watching a service in TV. But you could say, as I said earlier, the opposite. You could say that because we have now services that go all the way to your home, it somehow invites you or brings you in a more intentional way to be aware of Shabbat. And because of that, people connect more with services and prayers, because otherwise they wouldn't go anyway. It's not that our services were full of people before the pandemic, and once people started to go in Zoom, then we lost them all. So we are dealing with questions about how to reclaim Judaism, how to reclaim spirituality. We are talking, or I think we are dealing with a gap in terms of how the liberal Judaism nurtured spirituality over the last 20, 30 years. And what we are seeing today, which is this gap that we are not sure how to fill. And sometimes we tend to think that by facilitating more, by making things more simple, we are going to bridge it. I tend to disagree with that idea. I think that when we try to make things simpler or easier from this perspective, and I'm not talking about accessibility, talking about over-facilitating and then simplifying to a level that it feels unimportant or irrelevant or unauthentic. So I think that that's one of the biggest problems that we are dealing with, and the challenge is to reclaim Judaism as a compelling practice, as a compelling
I totally
interaction.
agree with that analysis, with the caveat of, I think what we need to be thinking about this coming year, and this gets me to, I think one of the most important things that the liberal Jewish community could do now is double down on efforts to cultivate what I'll call a community that has Shabbat lunch together. And what I mean by that is, however people connect in terms of shul, whether it's Zoom, not Zoom, even not going to shul, that's fine. Obviously, I want people to go to shul. I'll just make that clear. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that the most important element of a community and continuity and really experiencing Shabbat are those Shabbat lunches where you sort of meander over to a friend's house and, no one's keeping track of time and you're just sort of hanging out for the day. And that's really, I think, where Shabbos needs to be increasingly felt, as opposed to Shabbat being a day in which you go to services in the morning and then it turns into a Sunday, the second shul ends.
Well, if you go to services in the morning, like because the challenge that we are dealing with is not that people are choosing Zoom or live streaming or showing up to shul. But what we are dealing with is that Shabbat became an important for many Jewish families, but also for many Jewish communities, for keilot, for congregations. And I think that in an organizational level, communities, synagogue, shuls, they need to claim Shabbat as the central square of our town. Now, we have a village, communities are a village. We need to say that not only to say, we need to act as if Shabbat was the central square of our town. And we want everybody to show up or to connect or to celebrate around this central square in a time in which we feel at once so connected by social media, but also so dispersed. At a time in which the Jewish community is so integrated in all aspects of American life. The only thing that can hold us together is our awareness of time. I often speak about the Jewish calendar in that context, but the initial foundation for that is Shabbat. So then there are a variety of practices or possibilities or images. The image that you were describing in terms of sitting for Shabbos lunch with friends and losing notion of time. It's wonderful. That might be a possibility for certain communities. For some people, that's a fantastic practice. But we need to develop a variety of practices that enter this concept of the Socher Shabbat that Kushner speaks about. Remember the distinction between Shomer Shabbat, the Socher Shabbat, the one who keeps Shabbat in a more traditional way. On the other hand, the one who remembers Shabbat, make sure that everything they do in Shabbat is somehow related, oriented to connecting ourselves with the Shabbat experience. And I think that that's an important challenge. So I would call the Jews should be thinking about reclaiming Shabbat, connecting more deeply with Shabbat and therefore with spirituality and with each other.
I love it. And I can't help myself, but say one more thing on that. I promise we will move on. The one thing that I'm worried about, but I'm optimistic that with the right intentionality we can change in the year to come is, you spoke so beautifully about how Shabbat is a sanctification of time, right? Heschel speaks about this. Obviously, the Torah speaks about this.
Yeah, it's not about the Torah.
Yeah, there we go. Well, unclear which was the Torah inspired by Heschel or vice versa. The question of, or the potential problem of, if Shabbat is centralized around the shul, that is no longer a sanctification of time, but the sanctification of place, which I think is problematic. And so obviously the shul is an important cornerstone of how you spend that time. But if I say Shabbat to 100 Jews and, what's the first picture that comes into your head? I don't want them to all picture a shul.
But that's the chicken and the egg situation, right? Like, because in that expectation that you have, or in that picture that you would like to see, you have a Shabbat awareness, you have knowledge, you have a practice, you have something that brings you to celebrate Shabbat that way. Is that the case for most liberal American Jews? Do they have that picture? Do we have that picture in the back of our minds? So it's very difficult to return to a place that you cannot picture. And therefore, we do have, as synagogues, as communities, the responsibility, and I would say in a simpler level, the role of modeling a Shabbat experience that, if we do that with enough vision, will translate later on how people want to celebrate Shabbat in their homes, with their own interpretation.
I 100% agree. And this is why I think,
therefore it's the chicken and the egg, right? So you would think that because of your family experience, you are seeking for a synagogue, for a shul, to partner with you and nurture what you cannot achieve as a family and you need to achieve as a community. Well, in this case, what we have is that families many times have a need for connection. They don't necessarily have a picture of what they are looking for. And I think that our role as Jewish educators is to provide the context, to create the experience together with our families, and hopefully to work with them, not only to inspire them, but to provide them with tools to develop the Shabbat experience and to translate that into their own lives.
100%. And I'll give you the last word on this. One, because I want to move on. Two, I know we can talk about this forever. Just one note for listeners. I did give a 4-part lecture series over the summer about specifically this idea of Shabbat. If anybody wants it, feel free to get in touch. So let's move to something a little bit easier than Shabbat and post-COVID, which is Israeli politics. So we are at an interesting time. I mean, it seems like we're always at an interesting time. Who knows whether or not the government will happen in Israel now. We're coming up on a new election. There's an interesting trend that's happening. I mean, not that it's necessarily new, but I think it will continue to be talked about in the year to come, where we have a situation where the Israeli government is becoming increasingly right-wing, right? This isn't something new. This has been happening for 10, 20 years, both in terms of politics, also in terms of religion, right? A lot of things that run-of-the-mill liberal American Jews, aren't so much in favor. At the same time, left-wing attacks in the West against Jews and anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism are also getting worse. And so this has just led to so much confusion. And the confusion is now seeping into really every level of society. I mean, it used to be that, okay, you would hear about this happening in college campuses and maybe far left political groups. Over the past couple of years, I've now heard from more and more both high schoolers and parents of high schoolers that this is coming to the high schools. I've now heard this is coming into the middle schools. This is obviously all over social media in terms of discussion about Israel. I'm curious what you think big picture. What is the American Jewish community's role in terms of our conversation about Israel, right? What should we try to accomplish, right? What is it possible to accomplish?
Oh, no. But a great friend of mine once wrote an article and he called it, we need to move from Israel advocacy to Israel education. I think it was you, right? So that, let's start by the United States, and then I'd like to say a word about Israel. I think that for many years, the Zionist approach to Israel in our communities was to do Israel advocacy, to nurture this status of being in love with Israel. And I think that being in love can be heart crushing. There's a level of unawareness that happens when we are in love with something in which we don't notice the problematic, or we decide to be oblivious to the problematic aspects of this entity or subject or object that we are in love with. And I think that the aspiration of education around Israel should be to create a deep relationship with Israel, to love Israel. There are so many reasons to love Israel. Abraham Infield says that for many, many years until the state of Israel was created, the most common adjective next to the word Jew was refugee. Since the state of Israel was established and created, that disappeared. That disappeared from our lexicon. Our children are growing up without thinking about Jews as refugees, and we owe that to the state of Israel. So there are many reasons to love the state of Israel, and things that we love, people that we love, sometimes are not perfect. The state of Israel is not perfect, and I think we need to be able to see it, to criticize it, and we need to develop conversations around Israel. And I think that if we don't develop those conversations, we instead of growing closer, we grow apart. So we try not to criticize, so we don't distance ourselves from the state of Israel. But that's in my opinion the wrong approach. Now, one word about the Israeli society. Micha Gutman, wonderful scholar, one of the, in my opinion, best or most prominent Jewish thinkers of our time. He speaks about the outcome or the outcomes of the digital revolution. And he says that, and he compares between the American society and the Israeli society. He says that one of the clear outcomes of the digital revolution is that people tend to be more polarized in their conversations, because but they're not conversing. They are interchanging or monologues. And that left and right, and we know that very well in the United States, grew apart. They are more distant than ever. Now, in Israel, left and right, they attack each other more than ever before.
Mhm.
But ideologically, they are not as far from each other. Most right has understood and accepted the idea that there is no a real chance for Eretz Israel Hashlema, for the whole land of Israel to be a part of the state of Israel. And this is true for most of the right in Israel. There are some groups in the far right, but most right wingers know that. For the left, most left knows that it's very difficult now to find a partner to create shalom, to create peace. They understand that there's way more nuance than what they used to require. So politically speaking, they've never been that close. The speech is still very far from each other. And I think that for the American viewer, here from the Gola, from the diaspora, it's very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to understand that the Israeli society has moved politically to the center that is mostly centered to the right, and it's not that much in the far right or in the far left. Even though when we see some extremists coming, as the case of Itamar Ben-Gvir, this member of the parliament that seems to be doing very well for the incoming elections. So they do get some support, but it's a very specific support. And even the right doesn't want to be that engaged with him. They want his seats in the Knesset, but they clearly don't want him. So there's an interesting dynamic happening there.
Yeah, no, that's all really interesting. And I think I agree with everything you just said. There's an interesting trend when it comes to American Jews, very much, I think, the importance of nuance, the importance of education. I like how you plug the article. I promise I'm not giving Nico any royalties every time anyone clicks.
But you should put a link next to this talk.
Yeah, I should. That's a good idea. I just need to figure out how to actually do that. But, slowly learning this technology one day at a time. A lot of times I've seen when Americans, I won't even talk about American Jews, when Americans talk about Israel, the vast majority of the time, they're not actually talking about real Israel. They're using Israel almost as a metaphor for whatever their gripes are in terms of America. So I see your face for a second.
So I didn't understand your question.
No. You answered the first part of the question. This is sort of, moving along a little bit, because I see this firsthand, both in American political discourse and on campus, where you have the far left attack against Israel. Some of it is, we can debate the extent to which it's rooted in actual fact on the ground. A lot of it is obviously just a mirror of American political discourse, that they're just using Israel as sort of, I don't want to say a scapegoat, but a metaphor. And I think in the
go
for it.
So let me just, I feel very strong about this. Let me intersect you for 1 second. In the left, the problem that we have right now is that Americans in the far left, I would say, they see Israel through the lens of historical conflicts and struggles in the United States. So they judge the interaction between Israelis and Palestinians through the lens of slavery in the United States, and then Israel becomes a white supremacist, and so we get all these out of context definitions, and I think that what it shows is the lack of nuance in those that are accusing. Like this idea that if this lens work for America, they should work for everyone else. And I think that's so problematic. So problematic. And sorry,
I appreciate the interruption, because that's actually where I was going. I think you said it a lot stronger than I did. I think there's also some element happening in sort of the wider American pro-Israel community, not to the same extent of being mirrored through an American lens, but the way that a lot of people relate to Israel. The famous example is the Leon Uris Exodus book that was published in the 1950s of sort of Israel being this fairyland, and most American Jewish experience of Israel is on a birthright or equivalent trip. And I love birthright. I'll be leading a trip in a couple months, so nothing against birthright, but a lot of the way that we relate to Israel also in the American Jewish community is this sort of fairy tale, almost like a Jewish holiday, right? Like we have Pesach when God took us out of Egypt and we wandered through the desert into Israel. And then we have 48 and 67 when, we won these heroic wars. And again, there's a failing to deal with a lot of the nuance of politics, because the way that we're relating to Israel is almost as a deeply Jewish value, which is great. But I think that then clouds some of the ability to actually come in and say, okay, well, the state of Israel, not the land of Israel, the state of Israel is a political entity. It's a political entity with, pluses and minuses, just like all political entities. And oftentimes, whenever criticism of that political entity comes to the forefront, a lot of people feel personally attacked because, wait, this is my story. This is my Jewishness. Whereas the reality is, yes to everything you said in terms of Israel is, of course, a crucial part of Jewish identity, all of that. And also, because the state of Israel is a political entity, that should be able to be discussed, criticized, condemned whenever they do something that's worthy of that. And there should be no contradiction there, even though for a lot of people, it does feel like there is.
Yeah, rightfully so, in terms of being able to criticize the state of Israel. I think that one of the things that we have dealt with quite a bit lately is this idea of categorizing Israel as an apartheid state. And that's also so problematic, is to bring a definition on a category that existed in a different time, in a very different place, in very different circumstances, and to say, we're going to use this very strong concept to categorize something that we struggle with right now, even though if that obligates us to change the definition of that concept, which the Amnesty did, and in order just to tag on people's minds this terrible idea and connect that with how the interactions between Israelis and Palestinians go. The problem, first, the problem with that is that it's a fallacy, it's false. But the second problem with that is that when you say that Israel is an apartheid state, what you are saying is that Israel has no right to be. You are not criticizing the state of Israel. You are saying that the state of Israel is a system that has no right to exist, because let's be honest, apartheid states, they shouldn't exist. So when you come and say that, you are in a way denying the existence of the state of Israel. And I believe that for some people that's a claim that comes out of lack of awareness. But for some people, I think it's a very clear agenda to delegitimize the state of Israel.
Yeah, 100%. And just to plug a past podcast, I did a whole episode on Israel and the double standard after one of the recent reports about calling Israel an apartheid state came out. So if people are curious for a lot more conversation about that, I think it was literally called Israel and the double standard. So I guess moving. Yeah, there we go. Moving from one political mess to another, let's come back to America for a moment. Me and you, I think this was already 2.5 years ago, did a class series on the idea of civil debate in Judaism and how that might be able to be fomented and fostered into wider American society. For whatever reason, I'm still trying to figure it out. Our class must not have worked well enough because politics here hasn't been magically fixed after our 4-part series. So maybe we should have continued. But both in terms of a general sense of how we can bring Jewish ideas and Jewish values into our political discourse in a year where we obviously have the midterms coming up in a few months. There's, of course, the next presidential elections probably going to start sometime in the next year with people, starting to run. One, how Jewish ideas can affect that. And then two, on a more specific level, and you can sort of take this however you want, there's been a lot of discussion in the Jewish community about particular issues. I'm specifically thinking of the abortion issue that really proliferated through this year, and how specifically Judaism, as a very nuanced tradition, actually has views that don't fit into either political binary, and what sort of Jewish tradition and the history of Jewish nuance can bring to all of these sort of hot button issues.
So you're talking about abortion?
In the specific case, yeah.
It's an interesting thing that we have all these slogans and signs that say abortion is a Jewish value. And I hope I will say something, and I hope people keep listening for 30 more seconds. Abortion is not a Jewish value. Abortion is not a Jewish value. L'chaim, for life, is a Jewish value. Now, when we say life, we mean something very different. We mean that the life of the mother, and in a gender neutral way, the parent, takes precedence over the life of the fetus. And we have a variety of circumstances that include mental well-being and mental health to justify, to explain our claim or our idea. Abortion is not a Jewish value. Judaism is not advocating for abortion as a search in life. So again, when we speak in slogans, I think that we sometimes oversimplify, and sometimes that's how it works. But I think that the value is life, and from that perspective, I think Jews need to think about how we are going to guarantee people's lives. And there's a huge question around this for these elections. But this is also true for mental health. This is also true for healthcare. And by that, I don't mean that I know this is not a partisan claim. It's, I think that Jews should be concerned about the level of healthcare or mental care and accessibility to abortion, besides their partisan views, because we prioritize life and human dignity. And yes, from that perspective, then we have distinctions when a life begins, and that, of course, in the context of abortion, gives to most Jewish communities and thinkers and streams a clear line in terms of what we support and what we don't.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I really like that idea that we have to be wary about using Judaism as sort of a political spade. And, it obviously happens on both sides of the aisle. There, from a more almost epistemological sense, I'll use a fancy word there. In some way, I think the importance of having a robust tradition of discussion, such as Judaism on any number of topics, is to act as an important bulwark against any type of contemporary issues that come up. So that's not to say that every time a new issue comes up, let's defer to Jewish tradition. But I think part of the value of studying Jewish tradition is we're bringing 3,000 years of debate into our consideration on any contemporary topic. And so that actually, I think, is an important stopgap against every single week, well, a new issue comes up, I have no idea what I think about it, so let me just follow, whatever my partisan group is. I'm reminded of the famous Mordechai Kaplan line that halacha, or Jewish law, should always have a vote, not a veto, which I think is a really important consideration. I think abortion is a fascinating example there. Just as an aside, I'm going to be teaching my class at UC Irvine about Jewish text starting in a couple of weeks. And one of the weeks we talk about responses in the week that we delve into halacha and the halachic process. And so last year I had them read a 25-page responsa about COVID vaccination in Jewish law. This year I'm changing it up and I'm going to have them read an analysis of abortion in halacha. And it's the week I'm probably most excited about because I think it'll break probably every single stereotype one could have about religion and abortion and Judaism and all that.
Well, interesting. In that, I think it's kind of more than interesting. It's fascinating how we work because basically what you are describing is the nuance, like how things happen in conversation and we understand certain concepts as the outcome of an ongoing conversation. And the voices of the present, they're very important in the nuance that we are trying to find for that conversation, because we have our circumstances, we have a variety of motivations, because we live in a different society, right? I always like to say, in the context of a Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם, to make a Shabbos, to make this sacred value for your generation, an eternal covenant, right? Like, and this is true for other Jewish laws and for other Jewish ideas. Right? So we are thinking here for what does it mean to be seekers and protectors of life, and in that context, in my opinion, is to have, of course, to have a constitutional right for abortion and over your body, but we often kill the nuance, which is the foundation of our strength, in the simplification of a slogan. And I really want to emphasize this. We kill the nuance, which is the foundation of our strength, in the simplification for a slogan. And that goes back to what's more important, right? The study of Torah or fulfilling mitzvot. We like to have this conversation, and the rabbis answer, the study of Torah,
yeah,
because it leads to fulfill mitzvot. And I think that this connects us with this idea of the nuance. If we are engaging in conversation, if we are studying, if we bring depth to our arguments, I think that our actions become deeper and more meaningful.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that is, of course, true for abortion. I think it's true for politics writ large as well, where, yeah, I mean, we're not going to say anything new on the topic, but it is sad how all-consuming, I think, politics has become in a mostly detrimental way. And I think you really see the residual effects that it has on people, just in terms of the 24 hours news cycle and everything like that. I think this actually gets us to the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which, of course, is also not a new issue, but I think its importance is growing every year as the detrimental effect has every year. The wider, this is not, of course, a Jewish issue, but just wider mental health in America, really in the world in general, is in a really difficult state. I think, both because of COVID and isolation, but also just the proliferation of social media, which I'm just continuously convinced is, almost entirely negative, even though I use it a lot. And just all, listen, and just what it's doing to our society. And I think it's something that I've seen a little bit of Jewish organizations paying more and more attention and talking about things like loneliness and anxiety and depression and addiction more and more openly. Our last podcast was actually all about addiction and recovery. But I think this is something that we have to make a more explicit and conscious effort in the year to come. And, I think sadly, given the state of where we are, the problem is only going to get worse in the coming year. And so it's up to us more and more to make sure to take concrete steps to create those spaces and show that the Jewish community is open, inclusive, and has some of the resources that people that are struggling can use.
So help me understand you better. Are we talking about social media, or we are talking about a mental health crisis, or both?
At this point, I'm honestly not sure those two things can be disconnected super neatly. I mean, obviously mental health issues did exist pre-social media, right? I don't think social media is just the devil itself that came and started infecting everybody, but just there's more and more research coming out, especially as people are spending more and more time on social media, that it is a huge part, I think, of a growing mental health crisis, especially, I mean, this, the younger you are, I think the worse this affects you.
Sure.
And so at this point, I think honestly, part of a mature and honestly part of a reasonable education system, whether this is, wider American education or Jewish education, is responsible use of social media. Meaning I think all Hebrew schools should have classes about Judaism and social media. And what does it mean to be Jewish on social media? Not just in the sense where if I disagree with your politics, I write, Nico, you're an idiot, exclamation point, all caps. But actually, what does it mean for how we want to be intentional with our time? How do we want to spend our time? What does it mean to have a relationship with others? All of that.
So that's interesting because you are taking this to the place of how we interact with each other. And I think that that's certainly one of the challenges. The challenge related to social media that is most concerning to me is this search for approval, like how many likes I got, how many views we got, right? When you are talking about something that you are trying to sell, a podcast or something that you want to have exposure for, but that makes lots of sense. The problem is that
listen, Nico, the want for likes is bad, except for when we do it, right? When we post it, it's noble. We have no ulterior motives,
Yeah, correct.
Exactly.
But Jonathan Haidt speaks about that quite a bit in The Coloring of the American Society. This idea that social media is one of the main sources for teenagers, adolescents depression, because part what is happening there is that they post their picture, and now it's not it switched over the last 10 years. It's not anymore about your friends seeing a picture of you at some point. It's about how many people are liking that picture. What are the comments that you are receiving? And I think that to be in a status of constantly seeking for approval, in Facebook you can put your status, right? So the constant status for Facebook and social media in general is seeking for approval, seeking for support, seeking to make waves. And I think that, Jewishly speaking, what we need to do with our children and with ourselves to some extent is to help them and teach them how to rethink social media. Social media is here and it'll stay. So we need to talk about how to use social media responsibly, not only how we interact with others, but how we allow social media reflect on ourselves. That my biggest concern, as the dad of a child who is becoming a teenager, is once he starts using social media, how is that going to influence his emotional world? Because we have seen cases of children that crash over lack of support or approval, or because they were bullied in social media. So this is a real problem. And one of the problems is that our children see us all the time holding our phones, right? Like so that's what you do. That's what society does. That's what the adults, the cool people do. So I think that rethinking our relationship with social media is an important thing, and also how much we allow our anxiety to grow in our virtual interactions. I was reading something a couple of days ago that most people expect their emails to be answered within the hour. Don't write to me if that's your expectation, but what I mean is it's a very interesting expectation. And after an hour, people start to get anxious about an email if they are expecting an answer. So I think so the expectation is that we are on all the time connected, and if you didn't hear an answer, there might be something that's wrong. And I think that we really need to rethink our relationship with social media, our relationship with virtual communication. I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to the past, but we need to think about how we want to live our lives today using these tools that are fantastic, but when they're used, without lots of serious thinking and maturity invested in their use, they can be truly dangerous.
100%. And the only thing I'll add is, I think, connecting to what we started with, this is a great plug for Shabbat, really, because I think, part of any Shabbat practice, and, from secular to ultra Orthodox, I think, and very rarely do I give, prescriptions for how one should act Jewishly. I think all Jewish communities should try to cultivate at the very least, no social media on Shabbat, unless for very specific circumstances. I think it's a great way to cultivate, certainly with raising kids, in terms of, sure, 6 days a week, use social media, on the seventh day you rest, type thing.
There was this Shabbat manifesto that was online, that was actually very nice, and among other things, they speak about the use of social media, and it's a quite secular document. But the thing that I think this idea of yours of connecting the last part of our conversation, which is the use of social media and the interaction in virtual spaces, with the beginning of our conversation in terms of the rehab of the muscle of showing up in terms of Shabbat and communal life, it reminds me of this concept in Pirkei Avot, Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Don't leave the public. Don't leave the communal life. There's an interesting question around that. Around rabbis ask, is that even possible for you to live the life, to abandon the public life? And there are different opinions in terms of what's possible or not. But I would like to think that no, you can't actually disconnect yourself, abandon the life of a community. We need to be in community. And I think that it's important to choose and to be mindful of how we want to be in community. It is true about showing up in Shabbat. It is true about doing a Shabbos lunch. And it is true about how we want to interact in social media and with people that hold different ideas in the political spectrum.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, just to summarize everything, in the coming year, Jews should be thinking about, and Jewish communities should be thinking about, being more intentional about everything, right? I think, the really the imperative is to not fall into routine patterns and doing things just because, that's how wider society is going, or that's what we always do, or, this is sort of the flow, but actually consciously reflecting on every new thing that comes up. What do we think of this? How should we tackle this? How do we bring nuance in there to it? Anything else? What other questions, issues, topics? We have 2 or 3 minutes left, but any parting words before this Jewish New Year here?
So you think that Jews should be thinking about intentionality, and I will say that Jews should be thinking about community, how to be a part of the community, how to be intentional about building a community and holding on to community, and also about what are the communities they want to be a part of. Just like in the context of social media, an important thing. And once you identify your community and you feel deeply connected to your community, maybe you don't need to seek approval from everyone. You don't need 100 likes on Facebook. You just need to like those that are around you, or even when you disagree with them, and for them to like you to some extent. I think that that's an important thing. An important thing to keep in mind. We need to be intentional about building community.
Amen. Well, Rabbi Nico, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Yes, as always. And I want to acknowledge that I have some bias. I haven't argued with you too strongly because I love you. So-
We'll have to do another podcast sometime, maybe after the Chagim, where we just, the 5 issues we disagree about the most, and we can have a 6-hour podcast, and no one will listen to it except for us.
I would call it the 5 issues in which Daniel is wrong.
There we go. I love it. Well, Shana Tova, thank you so much. This is great.